Hey everyone, thank you so much for taking the time to join us this evening. We're glad to have you here on this webinar on the planning and response tool, Potential Operational Delineations, or PODs. Before we get started, I would like to take a moment to recognize that New Mexico as a state and as a community is still experiencing ongoing and devastating wildfires, and that these fires may persist in burning across the state until we receive summer rains. We continue to think of all the communities that are evacuated, the residents who have lost their homes, and the fire personnel who are still working so hard to contain these fires. This is a difficult time, and there's a long road of wildfire recovery ahead. We want to ensure you are all aware of resources which may be helpful in this challenging time. Those may be found through the FACNM webpage, the Forest Stewards Guild social media platforms, and we will also post links in the chat. So, to kick off introductions, my name is Rachel Bean, and along with my colleague, Gabe Kohler, we work for the Forest Stewards Guild in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Within my role, I help coordinate learning exchange webinars like the one you're here for today. And with that, I'm pleased to introduce today's presenters, Dr. Christopher, or Kit, O'Connor and Tyler Beeton of the USDA Rocky Mountain Research Station and the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute, respectively. Kit is a research ecologist with the Human Dimensions Program Wildfire Risk Management Science Team of the Rocky Mountain Research Station. Kit's primary research interest is in bridging the human and ecosystem dimensions of fire management, including the use of pre-fire planning and operational decision support analytics to promote ecosystem restoration and resilience, safe and effective suppression response, and sustainable forest and fire management systems. He is an analytics lead for the National Risk Management Assistance Program for Large Wildfire Management and a core member of the POD Strategic Fire Planning Team. The team is currently working with more than 60 national forests, 3 states, and numerous other public and private land managers to develop and implement sustainable fire management plans. Originally from Edmonds, Washington, Dr. O'Connor has a bachelor's in entomology from Penn State University, a master's in biology from the University of Quebec, and a PhD in natural resource management from the University of Arizona. He is a recipient of the 2019 Rocky Mountain Research Station Science Delivery Award and the 2020 Forest Service Deputy Chief's Award for Science Delivery. Kit lives in Missoula, Montana, where he enjoys trail running, mountain biking, and family campouts. Tyler is a research associate with CFRI. He is a collaborative decision support program manager, which includes managing, contributing to, and evaluating collaborative adaptive management processes with project partners and stakeholders. Tyler leads social science assessments of landscape-scale collaborative and forestry projects, coordinates and facilitates potential operational delineation, or PODs, workshops, and evaluates how PODs and risk management assistance products are used in incident and non-incident management contexts. Tyler holds a master's in anthropology, and he is working toward a PhD in ecology and human environment interactions at Colorado State University. We are really glad to have them both speaking with us today, and with that, I'll turn it over to Kit and Tyler.
Great, thank you, Rachel and Gabe. Thank you for the introductions. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. Okay, are you all seeing my screen up there?
It looks good, Kit.
Okay, great. Well, without further ado then, I will go and get started. Real quickly, I just want to acknowledge that there are a lot of contributors to this work, and this is very much a partnership. Some of this work originally came from the National Forest System. It was supported by research back in 2015, 2016, and then it has really proliferated through these partnerships with groups like the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute, Oregon State University, and support from Nature Conservancy, Forest Guild, and many other amazing partners that have really picked up this mantle and allowed it to carry out much more. So what we're going to be doing is giving a presentation, and then ideally we'll have a good 15-20 minutes to answer questions after the fact. So I'll just go ahead and get started then. Just a little roadmap of where we're going. I'm going to start with a little introduction of what we call PODS 101. This is kind of our introduction to what PODS are. And first of all, I do also want to just say that PODS is shorthand really for what we really know as strategic fire planning. So PODS is one of the tools that goes into strategic fire planning, and I'll get into that in a little bit more. But when you hear people talking about PODS planning and fire, what we're really talking about is this much broader framework of strategic fire planning. I'm also going to be talking about use of PODS and strategic fire planning in incident response. And then I'm going to turn it over to Tyler to talk about use for cross-boundary planning, prioritization, and implementation of fuels and treatments. So when we talk about this whole strategic fire planning concept, what we're really talking about here is very much these landscapes of the Southwest. These are so much of the Southwest, Arizona and New Mexico has these very fire adapted systems that oftentimes are significantly transformed from the way that they were when they were experiencing frequent fire. Fuel loads have gone up significantly. Oftentimes these landscapes are no longer nearly as climate adapted or fire adapted as they would have been in previous decades or ideally in previous centuries. And so what we're trying to really balance here is the need for fire on a lot of these landscapes to try and restore ecosystem function to so many of these landscapes, and think about how fire actually drives the ecology, the process of these systems, but then really balance that against our modern reality of human footprint on this landscape that is permanent. It is installed in so many of these landscapes. And there's kind of the public safety side of it, but then there's built infrastructure. There are critical components that are fire sensitive. And so thinking about how do we balance these two really kind of competing components of fire in the landscape? Well, we put a lot of this on our fire management operations, our fire management system. And that's a really, really delicate line to walk. And what we've seen, especially over the last 2 decades, is that our fire management operations system is getting overwhelmed. We, especially just in the last 5 years, have seen the largest and most severe wildfires across most of Western states. We're seeing massive uses of resources and often very low effectiveness. We're also seeing issues where firefighter safety is a supreme concern, and we aren't getting better at keeping firefighters safe. We're seeing that these extreme conditions, the job that we're asking our fire responders to take on, oftentimes is impossible. So how is it that we balance kind of these three components in a way that we can restore landscapes where we have an opportunity to do that? We can keep our public safe and keep our infrastructure safe. And then very critically is how do we make sure that our fire responders who are tasked with this are doing this in the safest and most effective way they can. So a lot of this framework shouldn't look new. If you're familiar with the cohesive strategy, it really touches on these three same key themes. The cohesive strategy is a little bit more of a theoretical framework for how all lands and all people can work together, looking at fire adapted communities. So that brings in, how do we harden our infrastructure? How do we make sure that the people that are living in these fire prone landscapes are living in a way that their homes are going to survive the next fire? What does safe and effective wildfire response look like? Well, a lot of that has to do with pre-fire planning and making sure that we're making the best decisions we possibly can prior to and during a fire when fires are being managed. And then lastly, this major component going forward is resilient landscapes. Are the decisions we're making today on how we're responding to fires going to put us in a better place for the next fire and for maybe 10 years out or 20 years out, for making sure that our landscape is going to be as resilient as it possibly can to all of the challenge of changing climate, changing vegetation, all those other components. So going back to my original framework, how are we actually tackling this? What's the operational side of this that takes us out of the theoretical realm and into action? So the first thing we look at is balancing natural resource management with asset protection. The way we do that is this tool called the quantitative wildfire risk assessment. And what this does, and you can see with the color schemes here, these green parts of the wildfire risk assessment, well, that is showing areas where we actually need more fire. And more of the right fire is likely to do a lot of good. And then if you move to kind of the right side of the continuum, we've got these red zones. These are areas where more fire is not going to help. In fact, more fire is going to do a lot of harm. And so there are parts of our landscape where we just cannot tolerate more fire. But ideally, these account for a tiny fraction of the area of many of at least our forested areas. And so if we can figure out where these areas are, and we can figure out our kind of a response related to that, suddenly we now have a framework we can work within. And that framework that we're working within is some of these tools that we provide to fire management operations to help with that safe and effective response. And so one of those tools is we can basically break up that risk that we can map out continuously across the landscape by our operational opportunities to act on that risk. And that's where pods come in, these potential operational delineations. These pods basically break up that risk into containers that we can actively manage toward. And we can do that in the pre-season with things like fuel treatments. And we can do that during an incident with an incident management team, understanding that each of these pods is actually a defensible fire container in the most basic way to think about it. And then you also notice on the right side here, I've also include kind of this traditional fire behavior modeling. It's also absolutely critical that we have kind of our modern fire infrastructure that we bring to fire management operations. So we have the best operating picture of what is today's load for resource use? What does today's fire weather tell us about our opportunities? And a lot of that we can also get out with this group here called the Risk Management Assistance Program. That's RMA. And I'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about fire season applications. So the quantitative wildfire risk assessment, real quickly, here's an example from the Tonto National Forest over in Arizona. And it follows those same kind of stoplight colors that I mentioned before. And you can see we now actually have actively mapped out, well, where are those red zones? Those areas where you're not going to tolerate fire because fire is likely to do a lot of harm, versus those green zones, those relatively natural areas that would benefit from the right kind of fire. And then we have a lot of yellow zones too, where, you know, it would kind of depend. It depends on what the fire is doing and what resources are in that area at that time. So within the risk assessment, we're looking at what is the probability that a fire is even going to happen. What type of intensity could we expect from those flame lengths? Is this likely to be a canopy fire? Is this likely to be a creeping surface fire when it does burn? And then given those two components, what would be the effects on the things that we actually care about? So what the quantitative wildfire risk assessment is giving us is basically this picture of how will fire affect these things that we're actively managing for. And we break those into two basic components. We look at what are the natural resources of the landscape. These are typically the most fire adapted components, kind of the natural components. It could be wildlife, watersheds, could be the actual plants and animals that live there, versus those built assets, kind of those human components of the landscape. And then what we do is we also look at what are opportunities to act on that risk assessment. So here's an example of potential operational delineations. You can see all these kind of polygons over there on the right side. So what are these pods? What are pods? They're fire planning units that are bounded on all sides by control features. And these are pre-identified by fire management experts who are basically vetting each of these locations. And oftentimes they're put together through a hybrid of these kind of analytical tools that tell us what the probability of success would be for a specific location on the landscape, or how difficult it would be to engage a fire in any part of the landscape. And then we weigh all of that against the real expertise of the people on the ground. And so we develop these through these cooperative workshops. We bring in the people who know the landscape better than anybody else, the fire managers, and ideally this is cross-boundary. This isn't just a Forest Service thing. This is all the people that could be affected by fire in a given location and who know about fire in that location, to look at some of these analytics, but then really to put their minds together and put lines on a map to identify these best available holding features that can then be joined together into these networks of pods. And this collaborative process really helps facilitate cross-boundary planning. It also gets people thinking about the same language. It allows them to kind of communicate where those opportunities are across the landscape, and it provides a template for going forward what fuel treatments could look like to be the most effective use of limited fuel treatment dollars. So what are these analytics that we talk about that go into this PODS process? Well, two of the primary ones that are also available on the Risk Management Assistance dashboard are something called the Potential Control Locations Model, or Potential Control Locations Atlas. And this really answers the simple question, where are fires least and most likely to be successfully contained given past fire conditions? So this model learns new data every year. It ingests a new fire season every year, and it's a machine learning algorithm that looks at, right now we're looking at 21 years of fire data across the entire Western United States to develop these relationships around what's a good holding feature and what's not a good holding feature. And then we can actually display that as a continuous probability surface. And that's what you see here with these kind of greens and red colors. Red colors are typically areas with very low holding probability. Those are areas where you have low probability of successfully containing a fire. Whereas these greens and blues, kind of the cooler the color is, the better the holding probability. And then suppression difficulty index is really just kind of a mathematical summary of a landscape, looking at what's the potential fire behavior, how bad could it get for any part of the landscape, and then what are all the opportunities we have to engage a fire, given our access, our ability to cut fire line, and some other kind of basic metrics. And so we think of potential control locations being, okay, where is fire most likely to be held? And we think of suppression difficulty index as, well, how would a firefighter size up this landscape? If they had to move people and resources to any corner of the landscape, you can use the suppression difficulty index to tell you how hard that would be. And the color schemes are very similar. Blue is good. Blue is areas that's very low difficulty. Red is tough. Those are areas that would be very difficult to get people and resources to those locations. So used together, you can actually combine these two products to look at where your best holding features are with the highest probability and your ability to get people there to help develop your pod networks. So as I mentioned before, this works best when it's done in kind of this social cross-boundary environment where we are looking at people across jurisdictions, but also within the same agency. We could be looking at fire staff, agency administrators, resource specialists, bringing everybody together to kind of look at these analytics and to speak the same language so they understand what the realities of fire are for the specific landscape. And it really allows people to develop a shared understanding of the values and expectations for fires going forward. And we can't stress this enough, but this collaborative process of bringing people together to look at some of these analytics and look at the opportunities is oftentimes a lot more valuable, just this experience of bringing people together, than the final product. Just having people build that trust to understand those fire realities. The other thing that we also really need to stress is that this is a physical cross-boundary process. And so here we're talking about not just drawing pods on our own ownerships, but really drawing pods to where the opportunities to stop fire are. Here's an example from the Santa Fe and Carson National Forests, where you can see that these pods go pretty far off the forest. It's not by intention. They're not trying to draw these pods any bigger than they need to be. But what they're doing is they're really trying to highlight only the best available control opportunities. And what we often find is, especially with national forest lands, Forest Service boundaries are often terrible locations to stop a fire. And so this is where it's so critical to bring in all the partners, everybody involved, to put together a landscape like this, or put together a map like this, I should say. So what does this all look like? Once on the left here, we've identified our control opportunities. We overlay that on top of the risk profile, and we get a map that looks a little bit like this combination of two things. Then we can start to summarize that risk into what we call these strategic response zones. And those response zones give us a sense of, well, what's the best kind of default response for an ignition in any one of these pods? And here in these green zones, for example, these are what we call a maintenance area. This is an area that's not ecologically departed very far. It would benefit from more fire for the most part, and there's very little transmission risk, where a fire started in one of these green pods is unlikely to do a lot of damage to anything around it. So this gives us some confidence that these green zones are areas where we can start kind of re-normalizing the fire regime in these areas. Then you'll notice a lot of this map is in this yellow zone, which is that restore zone. And in a restore situation, you've got an ecological system that would benefit from fire, but only under certain conditions. And you probably have some wildland urban interface and some other areas that would need to be defended, would need to be protected in advance. And so early season or late season could be reasonable times to take on a natural ignition in some of these areas and leverage it for fuel treatment and for risk reduction. But once you're in peak fire season, you're probably going to see a lot of fires being put out. But again, a lot of these yellow zones could be appropriate for things like prescribed fire under more kind of idealized conditions. And then more commonly, you see these red zones too. These red zones, these kind of the smallest pods you see out there, these tend to be near our urban centers, areas where we know we have a high density of people, a high susceptibility to fire. These pods are smaller typically because we usually have road networks in these areas. They're the most accessible because people are living there. So you typically have more opportunities to stop a fire if you need to. I'm not going to get into the other colors for the purposes of this exercise, but what you need to just keep in mind is kind of the 3 stoplight colors. It's kind of the easiest way to interpret these maps. So as mentioned, actually in the introduction, we're actually now up to, I think, around 63 forests involved. And we say forests, what we're really talking about is all of the landscapes that surround or border on Forest Service lands are now involved in this process. And we have the state of Washington, Oregon, and New Mexico have taken on in their 10 and 20-year state forest management plans, respectively, the adoption of pods also going forward. So these will become kind of all lands approaches to fire management going forward. So that's kind of the Pods 101 overview. I'm probably going a little too slow here, so I'm going to pick it up a little bit for use in incident management, and then I'll turn it over to Tyler. So this last component here I'm going to be talking about is how pods are actively being used in fire management. So some of you, if you've been tuning in to some of the pods talks early on, have heard some examples from, say, the Tonto National Forest. And a lot of those people say are kind of being overused. We had early success with managing fire for multiple benefits on the Tonto National Forest, specifically here on the Pinal Fire. So if you look in the kind of the upper left-hand corner here, there's that strategic response zone map. And in that square, you can see the location of where the Pinal Fire was. And it was located in one of these restore zones. It was this yellow restore zone. They got an ignition on May 8th, 2017. And they had already talked to the city of Globe. They had talked to the county commissioners. They had gone through and talked to all the private owners in the area and shared that strategic response zones map with them and said that if they have an opportunity to manage a natural ignition in this location for resource benefit, they'd like to try and take it if conditions are right. That May 8th date, conditions were very mild. In fact, a lot of this landscape was not really even burnable. So they actively managed this fire. They kind of curated it to even grow it in some areas, to kind of grow it all the way out to the pod boundaries, with their goal being to burn out as much of the pod as they possibly could before the weather changed, before the weather got too extreme. They thought they could basically burn it out and then contain it or cut it off before the weather changed. Because the fuels were burning so slowly, they actually, it took 3.5 or 4 weeks for that fire to really get going. And so once they had fully backed the fire off the top of the mountain range and got it down into the chaparral system, by then that chaparral system was available to burn. You can see that picture here in A. That chaparral system went up really hot. And so they actually had to rotate in a type 1 team to basically wrap this fire up. About 6 days of a type 1 team. And in the end, they did end up burning out an entire pod. And that's not usually the goal with managing fires within these pods, but they got about 7,000 acres of fuel treatment out of it. So here's an example of what that actually looked like. So on the Pinal Fire, here's where the ignition point was, and that's up on the Pinal Mountains. And you'll notice down below in the foreground here, those are all individual homes. That's kind of the extension of Globe out into the Pinal Mountains. And so there were a lot of houses. And there was concern that if this fire wasn't managed for resource benefit this year under the right conditions in 2017, then in coming years, maybe under peak fire season conditions, that a fire could come rip roaring right off the mountain and right down into the homes. And so their hope was to really do a fuel reduction treatment up in the mountains under the right conditions before they ever had to face an extreme fire condition situation. So they had the potential control locations model, and they used it to identify their pod boundaries. Again, just remember those red zones are areas where fire tends to spread. These green and blue zones are areas where you typically can contain a fire. So you can kind of see that pod boundary right there. And so here you'll actually see as the fire progressed throughout its burning periods, they were actively managing it. They were actively growing it out to those pre-identified pod boundaries, and just kind of making sure that this fire was giving them the results that they were looking for. They did night burning, they did aerial ignition. They basically kept the firefighters themselves completely out of the burn area because it wasn't safe to be there, and it was really, really rough terrain. They basically kept the firefighters out to the perimeters as much as they possibly could. And they really just tried to manage this fire out to the overall intended footprint of this fire, kind of the way you would with a prescribed fire, but at a much larger scale. And here you can actually see this is about as big as the fire got, and you can see the burnout operation, kind of this arm that comes out on the bottom of the fire. That last bit is when the Type 1 team came in. They did a big burnout at the very bottom of the mountain to basically create a backstop, protect those homes. In the end, this is what they got. They got about a 7,000 acre fuel treatment out of it. And those homes were never directly threatened. So what do we learn from this? What do you gain from kind of taking on all this risk in the preseason? And having to rotate in a Type 1 team, that cost a couple $1 million. And that was not intentional. And so kind of after the fact, we're like, well, okay, maybe you guys got lucky. What do we buy with taking on this risk? What did this actually get the city of Globe? Well, we actually only had to wait 4 years to get an answer to that. Just last year, the 2021 Telegraph fire burned this exact same landscape. And you can see the footprint of the Pinal fire is the only area that did not burn under high severity. And in fact, we have some numbers from this, and the kind of the black zones that are surrounding the Pinal footprint were on the order of 85 to 95% canopy fire high severity. Whereas if you look at the burn footprint of the Pinal fire, when it was actually burned in 2017, it burned at about 5% high severity. And then when it reburned 4 years later, it burned with an additional 1% high severity. So you can imagine what this bought that area. And you can see it completely stopped the Telegraph fire from burning into the canyons up above that you can see on the upper right corner there and into those houses. So it actually stopped the fire, it dropped it down to the ground, and eventually put the fire out completely. Not the entire Pinal footprint burned because there just wasn't enough fuel within that Pinal footprint for the Telegraph to continue. So there was a real payoff in the end. And so that's one of the reasons why we still keep bringing up the Pinal footprint. So I'm going to just real quickly give you kind of an overview of the 2020 fire season and how pods were used in Colorado. And then I'll wrap up with just a few more examples specifically on fires in New Mexico this year. So I'm going to have Monty Williams, who is forest supervisor up on the, I'm trying to remember, it's around Fort Collins. So Pike San Isabel National Forest, I believe, talk about kind of their pod strategy back in 2020.
So this is one of our, what I would call a fire shed. You may have heard that term. And this is an area that's from Wyoming down to almost south of the Rocky Mountain National Park. So about, 80 miles wide by 80 miles, 70 miles, 60 miles north and south, a fairly big area, but this is how big these fires move. And it's kind of the landscape that you need to be able to kind of look at to think about wildfire and what you're going to do about it. So y'all should see the pods. These are our pods. And it's interesting to note that this wasn't something we generated by ourselves. All the partners came in and sat down and said, where are those places that we could fight fire in these areas? And it built this map. It looks a lot like a burn map, if any of you are from the South, a burn block map, but it's different. And so this is the map that came up for us after everybody got together and said, yeah, if we had a fire here in X, these are probably the logical places that we could take that thing on. So one of the things that we did in northern Colorado, and we're doing throughout the forest now, is we wanted to take a strategic look and say, how do we manage fire behavior in these large spaces? We think that's probably the most important step and the first step for our piece of country. Maybe later we're going to get into more specifics, but in this chunk of country, we knew fires moved from west to east. A lot of the values at risk are sitting on the east side of this green line. And so what we wanted to build was a line of density reduction and prescribed fire that went from the Wyoming border south, south of the park eventually. If you start thinking about pods then, and this is maybe the first kind of indication of where pods might be a little different, you can see the set of pods that are affected in essence. And I know if James White's watching me, which I know he's not because he's in another session, but he'd tell me maybe you picked the wrong pods this morning when you built this. But from a philosophical standpoint, this set of pods kind of represents that strategy. Each one of those sites need to be treated in some way with density reduction and fire to create this barrier that we've come up with. So these are the burns, the existing work that we had done. That's the light turquoise. So these had been cut and burned prior to the Cameron Peak fire. And then here's the High Park fire in kind of a darker red, and the other dark reds are other fires. And we're done. Okay, if you'll start the video. So here's the Cameron Peak fire that started. And what's interesting is it made 3 big runs. And the first run and the second run both ran into places where we had treatments or the previous fire scar. And what I'm getting at is from a strategic level, we can look at these large firescapes and think about for our area, what do we need to do? And then we can actually start working on those parts and pieces and making that happen, one pod at a time. And I started out, and here comes the first run, and there it stopped right into one of our prescribed fires in the old fire. The second run's coming here pretty quick, running towards Red Feather, and it's going to slam into Pingree and Swamp Creek burns. And then the last fire, the last run's going to take. What have I done? Take a minute here, but there was nothing in its way. We had a project on deck ready to go. Long story short here is our strategic look actually made a difference in the places.
Oh, come on. Sorry, folks.
Where we had work done and in place, and it significantly altered the outcome of that fire. The pods are critical to that. If you think about 5-year plans and how you start to think about what work you do, it's not random. It's not about just going out and picking the easiest stand here or, oh, geez, we can get a prescribed burn in there. You got to think strategically in your watersheds about what do you need to do, and then you got to build the treatments to go do that. And where the pods really help you is that ability to kind of carve the landscape up into pieces. The old adage about how do you eat an elephant, one bite at a time, or maybe one pod at a time. And it gives you a place where you can communicate back and forth easily with your partners, with the publics, about what it is you're trying to do and why you're trying to do it.
Okay, so that's kind of a testimonial of pod use up in kind of the northern part of the Rocky Mountains. Of the Central Rockies, I should say, in Colorado. And this is just a really quick overview of Southwest pods and fires from 2020 to 2022. So this is the pods network in Arizona and New Mexico. And you can see a lot of fires within these pods, and you'll see quite a few of these fires crossing pod boundaries. But typically, I'd say about 3/4 of fires are contained within a single pod. Then we have a series of these large fires that make it into maybe 2 pods. And then we have these really rare events where a fire makes it across multiple pods. And so we do have extreme conditions where pods are not going to be stopping fires. But for the most part, I would say for the vast majority, maybe 95% of fires, 1 or 2 pods is what it takes to typically stop these fires progressing. And another thing to think about is that depending on the strategy used for that fire, these pods can be a very good way to kind of buy that social capital to manage an ignition for something other than a full suppression response. So kind of moving back into the 2022 fire season and understanding how incredibly serious it is for all of you down there in New Mexico. Here's an example of the Hermit's Peak fire. This is taken from this morning. This is from the Risk Management Assistance dashboard. And you can see the underlying potential control locations atlas map. And the Santa Fe National Forest doesn't actually publish their pods network. They provide them directly to incident management teams. They don't display them here on this dashboard. But what you can do is just kind of take a quick look at where the fire is right now and look at where those control opportunities are. And you can see that for the most part, this fire is getting hung up on areas where we have a very high probability of control. A lot of this area that's already burned is those bright red zones. Those are areas that are the kind of those fire wicks with very low probability of control. And you can see actually, especially unfortunately to the lower left, sort of be kind of the southwest side of this fire, there's still quite a bit of opportunity for that fire to spread to the south and west. Here's just another example, kind of zooming in so you can kind of get a sense of what that potential control locations product looks like. This is what's provided directly to incident management teams to allow them to basically create pods on the fly, to come up with a strategy that allows them to come up with these containment blocks that have the highest probability of success. You'll notice here in the red, these red zones are areas where the fire, that's the actual fire perimeter from this morning. These dots you see on here are the satellite detections of fire spread. Yellow being older than 24 hours, really focusing on kind of these red areas and red dots and orange dots. And you can see a pod, for example, here in the center of this image. Looks like the whole kind of eastern flank of this fire was contained within a pod, but we're starting to see some slop over kind of to the north and directly to the west because we've had these extreme winds. We've had these conditions that are extraordinary for this area. So real quickly, some take homes from all of this. Planning and preparation matters. Getting people on the same page about pods and what fire response could look like, and ideally getting fuel treatments in addressing these pod boundaries early on can make a huge difference in fire outcomes, but also recognizing that extreme events will happen. Large fires are happening more and more frequently, and pods are not the solution when used in real time to stop all fires. What they can do is give us a leg up on being proactive and getting our fuel treatments in the right place so that when these fires get started, ideally we have more probability of stopping them at as much of the areas we possibly can. Pods also allow us to look at these risk trade-offs. The analytics can be useful for telling us what are the values at risk, where's that fire headed, and where do we need to stop it? Kind of what are our highest priority stopping areas versus what are the areas where we are willing to tolerate more fire or even promote more fire. And then lastly, the big lesson here is that good decisions do not always lead to good outcomes. If you take hundreds of good decisions versus hundreds of bad decisions, then yes, you will see more good outcomes overall. But not every good decision has a good outcome. And so we need to make sure that we're not necessarily penalizing people based on the outcomes of fire, but really to examine the decisions that are made and what went into that decision, and making sure that what we're really scrutinizing is the decision itself, not the outcome. So with that, I will stop my share and hand this over to Tyler.
Well, thanks, Kit. That was a really awesome PODS 101 introduction and some examples of uses on incidents. My name's Tyler Beeton. I'm a research associate at the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute, and I'm going to walk you through a few examples of how pods are used for cross-boundary planning, prioritization, and implementation for fuels treatments, and really kind of get in a little bit more into the weeds about that video that you saw from Monty Williams, who's the forest supervisor on the Arapahoe Roosevelt National Forest in my neck of the woods out by Fort Collins. Make sure I can proceed here. So I just want to take a quick time check. I realize we have about 15 minutes left in this. I have about a 15-minute canned presentation, and I want to make sure that we have space and time for folks to ask questions if they have any, particularly because we have such a small group here today. So I may rush through a couple of these slides so that we have 5 or 10 minutes for questions towards the end. So just to provide a little bit of background for you all, at my role at the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute, I facilitate pods workshops and coordinate with forest and fire managers across Region 2 and Region 4 with several other colleagues at CFRI. And when we're talking with these managers about developing and deploying pods for spatial fire planning and incident response, most of the work today and most of the research that you see is really focused on how pods can support incident management. And Kit provided some really great examples of how that's being done. But what partners were interested in and wanted to know a little bit more about was how pods are used for treatment planning context. So what we did is we sought to address this kind of issue or need that partners were telling us that they wanted to know more about. So this is a very early stage preliminary exploratory case study where we had some key contacts in 3 different landscapes where pods are being used to implement treatments. We conducted a number of interviews and relevant document analysis to just get an understanding of how pods are taken at this 30,000 foot view of a spatial planning framework and how it's operationalized within the local management context. And then what are some facilitating and frustrating factors for incorporating pods into planning? And then finally, what I'll hit on a little bit towards the end is what are some recommendations to enhance its use in planning context. So the first case study that we did was the San Juan National Forest, which is in Southwest Colorado, and they used this concept called nested pods in order for them to prioritize treatments across boundaries. And what they did essentially, if you can see the image on the right here, is they have nested pods or pods developed at multiple scales. In 2019, they developed landscape scale pods as part of their forest-wide planning tool. And they have several district-wide environmental assessments through the National Environmental Policy Act or NEPA to have a prescribed fire program. They have a pretty progressive prescribed fire program in the San Juans. And what they did is they took these broader forest-wide pods, which you see in black there, and overlaid them with their prescribed burn pods. And when they overlaid those together, that's the ones you see in the hatched polygons there. When they overlaid them together, it really helped justify to their leadership that the landscape scale approach to prescribed fire was the right approach. And they use this nested pods concept along with the timing and location of timber sales, as well as considering prescription windows to prioritize where to work and why. It also supports a lot of internal communication with the non-fire and field specialist. They had several meetings after they developed these pods and looked at them at this multi-scale or nested approach and worked with the resource specialist to really identify what are the values and resources and assets of concern within those pods. Why do they need to do the work? Why do they need to do prescribed fire work in one pod versus another? And what are the potential management strategies that they might employ if and when they get an unplanned ignition? And then the third level of that nested pods concept is a pods development process that was developed across lands by the Rocky Mountain Restoration Initiative, and that's those pods that you see in the pink there. The Rocky Mountain Restoration Initiative is a cross-boundary collaborative trying to identify and treatments and increase the pace and scale of treatments to enhance forest resilience, water and wildlife, and recreation interest. And they went through this process of developing these larger pods to inform joint work planning, but also to prioritize treatments across boundaries. And the San Juan National Forest has been working very closely with them to tailor and prioritize some of the work that they've been doing within those larger pods to conduct some landscape scale treatments. Another cool thing that the San Juan has done with pods and informing their prescribed fire program is they've developed this automated decision support tool. where they're able to pull in fire and weather information, when prescribed burns have happened in the past, and relating those to some of the desired conditions of those burns and using those to populate their burn plans. Similarly, they're using this as an outlook tool. So the day of a burn, they're developing prescription outlooks for what is the fire weather and behavior potentially going to be, and identify the best day for them to have a broadcast burn. It also integrates with the wildland fire response in several ways, particularly the information within this automated decision support is summarized in the downwind pod, to account for spotting and what is the potential for escape from that pod, so that they understand what is the fire behavior going to be if and when you have an escape or a spotting event. And then finally, they integrate a lot of these tools with wildfire response areas, so they can consider things like contingency planning and resource allocation on the day of the burn. And I just wanted to pull in this one quote that really captures this notion of what they're trying to do is really blend those lines between wildfire mitigation through prescribed fire, but also wildfire response by using a lot of the same tools for both efforts. I think in the interest of time, I'm going to skip this one, and then I'll talk about the third case study. So the third case study that we looked at was the Washington Department of Natural Resources, and under House Bill 1784 in 2019, they were required by law to develop a treatment framework for the dual benefits of both forest health and wildfire response. And to do that, what they did is they decided to use pods as an organizational framework to help identify those prioritized treatments across all lands across Eastern Washington. And what they did was they implemented this in several planning areas across Eastern Washington. The figure on the top shows you just one of those planning areas relative to the other planning areas. And what they did was it was pretty unique in the sense that they prioritized where to treat on the landscape for forest health benefits within those pod containers. Remember, Kit said essentially what pods are those operationally relevant spatial containers. And within those containers, you can summarize relevant information. So they summarize information like drought vulnerability, what is the current forest structure, what's the wildfire transmission to homes, and combine those in a way to identify where they want to treat on the landscape, doing landscape scale treatments. But they also did this unique prioritization process where they identified along those PCLs or along those potential control lines, where are areas where need to be treated for safe and effective wildfire response. So they included things like where are the homes and infrastructure, where is the important drinking water, where is the commercially managed lands, and then prioritized along those PCLs as well. So it provides a platform and a process to not only identify where you need to do landscape scale treatments across pods, like Monty was talking about in his video, but also where can you do shaded fuel breaks or fuel removal or provide better access along those PCLs. So if and when you do get a fire ignition, firefighters can safely and effectively do their job. So just real quick here, and then I'll finish up with some recommendations. The Washington Department of Natural Resources is using pods in a number of ways. They're using it as a communication tool with private landowners to help build that shared understanding of the need and the purpose to do work and why they might need to work in one place over the other to start based on where that fire risk is relative to a landowner's home. It's also helped secure funding and plan across jurisdictions. It's really helped some conservation districts secure very large grants to treat along PCLs and within those pod boundaries. It provides that framework to secure grants and funding. And managers and communities are using the dual benefit framework for implementation. The Nature Conservancy and a local fire adapted community have jumped on the board as soon as this treatment prioritization framework came out and have started to treat along those PCLs to protect their community if and when they have a start. So some recommendations, and I really do want to leave it about 5 minutes open for questions. Some recommendations that we heard from folks in terms of how do we enhance the use of pods for planning, and in particular, and one of the most listed recommendations was the need for internal and external communication and outreach. So having that early and often collaborative process, not only with the fire managers and line officers, but also with interdisciplinary teams, other resource specialists, with local communities, county commissioners. They wanted specific types of information like story maps and short briefs. As Kit mentioned, this started on National Forest System lands and has since moved over to all lands. However, a lot of the briefs and the information and research is about how it's being used on public lands management context, and particularly in heavily forested system. And folks wanted to see information of how you might use pods in non-public land management context. Having clear leadership, direction, and intent at the local, state, and national level was super important, particularly having leadership direct and support the pods process by making pods a priority, allocating time, resources, and energy to both develop and maintain pods was super important. And as Kit mentioned, you just can't ignore the collaborative process. I say this 3 or 4 times every time I do a pods workshop, and Kit has mentioned it as well. Folks continually tell us that the collaborative process is just as important as the products themselves. And those are key factors in developing tools that are locally relevant, useful, and used in the end. So some key takeaways from the whole presentation today that I just want to highlight is, one, pods provides a framework for co-producing actionable science that's improving our fire management response while also improving mitigation efforts. It needs to be collaborative and inclusive. It provides a common language for fuels management, collaborative planning, and incident response. It's very synergistic with the risk management assistance program, which Kit mentioned. It helps to communicate and coordinate wildfire strategies across boundaries and with communities. And finally, as I just highlighted in the last few slides, it's really provides a mechanism to prioritize landscape treatments to address future fire problems. So with that, I'm going to end it. I'd love to, if we have a couple moments, to have some questions. If we don't have time for that now, I also just want to mention that we're obviously going to share these slides, and here are some relevant resources and links for folks that have other questions, but also feel free to reach out to Kit or myself if you have any other questions related to what we presented today. Rachel or Gabe, do we have a couple minutes for questions? I can't see the chat.
Yep, we can go ahead, and if anyone has any questions, please type those in the chat box now. If it's all right with you guys, I'll go ahead and just kick off the Q&A session, and it's okay if we go a few minutes over the hour as well.
Great.
So modeling tools such as pods often rely on historical site conditions and weather data to inform predicted fire behavior in elements such as the prevalent wind direction. And you mentioned that the analytics of pods uses includes machine learning, which takes in data from each fire year as it's happening. So I guess I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little more on how pods has the capacity to be informed by that more precise on-the-ground data, and as well as to reflect predictions of how climate change may impact future fire behavior, especially with regard to things like wind and fuel, moisture, things like those.
So those are excellent questions. And those are kind of the next phase of these analytical tools that we're looking at. Right now, we're explicit with the long-term analysts and kind of the fire operations staff about what the conditions are that go into our models. And so we're using these average seasonal conditions. Like we look specifically at the period of peak fire conditions for each landscape that we're modeling on. And we use what's generally considered 90th percentile. So areas that can burn well under those conditions, but it's not extreme. Because we figured that fires aren't being contained under those extreme conditions. And so what we'll typically do for decision makers is be explicit about the inputs that go into the actual modeling, so that they can then kind of adjust the model in their mind, saying, okay, if it's green under 90th percentile and we're currently 99th percentile, then that probably should be yellow, or maybe that should even be an orange. Whereas if they're winding down at the end of their season, and they're seeing that this was run at 90th percentile, but now we're down in the 80th or even the 78th percentile or something, then suddenly a lot more opportunities start to become available. Where we're going with this, ideally, will be a daily model, or even a burn period model. So it could be like an 8-hour model. For that, we need detailed fire progression information, and we need very detailed climatology information at fine scales. And so we're working on those data sets now, so that we can actually start to look at, what does the 3-day forecast say for wind and for fuels, and kind of conditioning of fuels and those types of things. And that would actually give us a much more detailed look at the quality of our control opportunities and how they're likely to change over the next few days. But that's probably still a couple of years out.
Okay. So it sounds like you're essentially just enabling this tool to take in the data as it's available and to improve as you go. Awesome.
Yeah, and one way to think about it too is, although climate change obviously is directional, and we are moving into hotter, drier conditions kind of in general over the last several decades, at the daily time step, you can still point to some day that happened 20 years ago that's just like today's extreme condition day. It's just the number of those extreme condition days is increasing. And so we have more of these high severity days in any given fire year now than we used to. And so if we can train our models to capture that variability, and we find an analog day, say in 2015, to capture what's going on in 2022, we basically repeat that 2015 day for 2 weeks, even though in 2015 it only happened once. So that allows us to actually model out what those conditions could look like. So that's kind of one way you could adapt to the changing climate condition.
Great, thank you. That's a great answer. That's what I was looking for. So as we're wrapping up, I have one other question, which is maybe a little more relevant to some of the folks who might be watching this particular webinar, which is how does community planning, such as the fire adapted learning network that we're on now, how does that fit into the strategic planning of pods? And what can fire aware community members really take from this presentation?
Tyler, do you want to start with that, or do you want me to try?
Why don't you start, and then I'll tag on at the end with some examples from the work we've been doing.
Okay. Well, so there's some really good examples out of Ashland, Oregon. One of our collaborators at Oregon State University, Chris Dunn, has really tried to take on how do you downscale pods to the community level, working directly with Chief Chambers, the fire chief for the city of Asheville, and all the emergency preparedness staff of a municipality, and looking at kind of the pod network and how it abuts an actual community, and then creating that kind of crosswalk between a community wildfire protection plan and a pod network, understanding they are two very different scales. Typically, public lands are managed at these much kind of coarser scales because we're managing for ecosystems. Whereas community level, you're looking at evacuation routes, you're looking at public safety and human life, and so it's just much finer scale. But there have been some examples of looking at kind of urban fire transmission corridors, and ways that you could kind of, if fire is going to be coming out of the public lands, it's likely to enter the community this way, and vice versa. When fire comes out of a community, how is it likely to affect those public lands? So there are a number of ways to look at it. I think we're mostly in the pilot mode with that, but I'll let Tyler speak to some additional examples. But Asheville has one of the most developed programs that I'm aware of at the moment.
Yeah, thanks for that, Kit. You know, with the example I just presented on Washington DNR, particularly, they led a very a highly collaborative process to identify what are the resources, values, and assets of concern, and use those to prioritize within those pods, and specifically brought on the Kittitas Fire Adapted Community to help establish those and identify what those priorities should be. Because, you know, we have to remember the analytics are fantastic, but not all QRAs, not all quantitative wildfire risk assessments are created the same. They don't always apply to local needs, depending on the scale and the resolution of how you're developing those. So really the advice there is to make sure that the risk assessments and the data that you're using that summarize within those pods to inform your response, and it really needs to be locally driven, and making sure that there's a really designated collaborative process. It's bringing all the right people in the room early and often to the table to make sure that those priorities are identified and that local data is needed if and when it's appropriate to do so.
Great, thank you for that. And you know, I think that what you just touched on, ensuring that it's local, that's a huge part. And then Chaska also commented that there's also a lot of work to be done on the communication side of pods, and that's one direction where I imagine this would go moving forward. So, well, I do want to respect everyone's time. We don't have any more questions in the chat, but for everyone who's on, I put Kit and Tyler's contact info in the chat on Zoom as well as on Facebook Live. So please feel free to reach out to us, to reach out to them if you have any follow-up questions. And I just want to thank both of you so much for taking the time tonight to come on and talk about this. And I look forward to doing it again in the future. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Kit and Tyler.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Rachel and Gabe, for organizing all this.
Have a good night, everybody.